Hi, James.
Hi, Will.
How you doing today?
Good. How are you doing?
Very well, thank you. Let's introduce ourselves. I'm Will Wilkinson of the Cato Institute, and you are James Fowler, a professor of political science?
That's right, at UC San Diego.
At UC San Diego.
Yeah.
And you're one of the authors of a new book called Connected.
Right.
I'm holding it up. The Surprising Power of Our Social Networks and How They Shape Our Lives. And tell us a little bit about your co-author and a little bit about your book, and then we'll plunge in.
Sure. So Nicholas Christakis is my co-author, and he's a professor at Harvard Medical School and also in the Department of Sociology. And our story really is a social network story. Nicholas, his first job was really to explore the widower effect, which is this thing that happens when one person dies in a couple, then it reduces the longevity of another person. And he wanted to know what happens to the next person, to that person's friends, or that person's friends of friends. And so he came to Harvard and gave a talk when I was a graduate student there. And my advisor, who knew I was interested in seeing how political things spread in social networks, heard him give his talk. And he said to me, "You guys are talking about the same thing." And so that was about 7 years ago. We've been doing research together ever since then, and this book is a culmination of some of that research and also lots of really interesting stuff that other people have done that's related to it.
Excellent. So I've seen 3, 4, 5, 6 trade books about networks in the last decade or so. How would you say Connected is different from, Duncan Watts' book or a number of those others that came out a few years ago?
Well, for one thing, we're talking about real-world social networks. And so I think some people, they hear that our book is about social networks and they think Facebook, MySpace, Twitter. But we are really interested in these networks that have existed for hundreds of thousands of years. We've always had friends, we've always had family members, and we've always existed in these complex, beautiful webs of relationships. And we really want to know, these things are so regular and so ubiquitous. How do they form? Why do they have the shape that they have, and what is it that flows across them? And one of the very first things that we looked at whenever we were first studying this great data set we got out of the Framingham Heart Study was the spread of obesity. And so in that study, we actually were able to find that when your friends' gain weight, then it increases the likelihood that you'll gain weight. And so this is just one chapter where we talk about how health effects spread through networks. We also talk about how political factors spread through networks, how money spreads through networks, how emotions spread through networks. And the reason why we do this is because I don't think it's possible to understand MySpace or Twitter or Facebook, those online social networks, until we really get a handle on what's going on in our real-world social networks.
Terrific. You start out. I want to maybe talk a little bit about some things you mentioned at the end of the book first that I find especially interesting, and then move into some of these specific examples that you gave about how things like obesity or voting behavior move through networks. So toward the end, and this is one of the things that I liked a lot about the book was the idea that thinking about networks and the way they affect us offers a kind of third way between a couple of extremes in the social sciences. So on the one hand, you have the sort of extreme atomistic individualism of sort of Homo economicus. On the other extreme, there's kind of radical holism of certain kinds of sociologists or anthropologists. And you're doing something different. You're picturing human beings and their decisions as embedded in a network of people and a network of social influences. But it's kind of neither of those other things. Could you elaborate a little bit on what's unique about doing social science from the perspective of networks?
Sure. So, the last few centuries in social science have been sort of like a tennis match, where we've been going back and forth between the individual and the group. And so you have this great work done in the 18th century where we first started to really study decision making. And you had great mathematicians, and you had some of the first great social scientists like Adam Smith trying to think about individual decisions and individual incentives. And there was a real reaction to that in the next century by scholars like Durkheim and Marx, who thought that, no, you're missing it. There's actually this thing that's going on that's larger than individuals in these groups. But the problem with that research was that they got so obsessed with groups that they started to think that individuals were the groups, right? You no longer had, individual consciousness. You had group consciousness. You did whatever the proletariat told you to do, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so we had a reaction to that in the 20th century, and we started developing some neat methodological tools. And so statistics came along. We started doing a lot of empirics. And one of the fundamental assumptions of the ordinary least squares regression model is that the observations have to be independent. We also had this really great innovation in terms of game theory and the rise of microeconomics. And again, what do you have to assume? You have to assume that preferences are independent. Now, those assumptions are great. We made a lot of progress in the 20th century making those assumptions, those Robinson Crusoe assumptions, to understand how people behave in a vacuum. But as it turns out, those assumptions often drive the science. And it's driven us off a cliff, really, because we got to a point where we couldn't understand some complex phenomena. These are complex phenomena that we've only recently started to understand in terms of the relationships between people. And so sociologists have been studying social networks for a very long time, for the last 40 years. But physicists kind of came on the scene in the late 20th century. Duncan Watt, Laszlo Barabasi, Stephen Strogatz. These guys really applied some elegant, beautiful mathematics to these networks and made the whole scientific community realize that to understand complexity, you needed to move beyond the individual, but not all the way up to the group. You needed to focus on the relationships between groups and how those relationships structure interactions and how they cause things to flow from one node to another in the network. And for human beings, what that means is that what we should be thinking about is these social contagions. Things like political behavior, things like emotions, things like love and sex and your health behavior.
Terrific. Well, I find this it's a great perspective myself. It's really illuminating. I mean, we all, I think, grasp that, and I think it's become more and more unavoidable and broadly acknowledged that individuals are richly socialized and that we are a social species. But the thing that I see as really adding to just the idea that we live in groups is that our sociality has a structure, that we are related to one another in distinct ways, and there are regularities in those kinds of relationships, and the structure of our relationships makes a difference that we might not notice or sort of be conscious of the influence that the structure of our relationships is having on our lives, but the influence is there. I was wondering if I could get you to, because I thought it was helpful as a starter in the book, you lay out right at the beginning a few sort of rules about social networks that help us sort of understand them and our relationship to it. I don't mean to give you a pop quiz on your own book, so I understand it. But I think you have had sort of 5 rules about the way about our relationship to networks, and I wondered if we could just walk through those real quickly.
Sure. So 2 of these rules are related to the shape of networks, and 3 of them are related to what flows across them. So the first 2 are pretty obvious. We shape our networks. And so the very first thing that you have to realize whenever you're studying anything about networks is that they're not fixed. They're not given to us. These networks evolve as a result of us choosing to be friends with someone, choosing to work in a certain location, choosing to live in a certain neighborhood next to neighbors, choosing to marry the perfect person. And so it's these choices that aggregate to create these complex patterns that yield this behavior that's really fascinating. The second rule is that those networks then shape us. And so, one of the examples that we give for how the structure of the network actually matters is some great work by Peter Behrman on suicide in adolescent girls. He looked at girls who had best friends And he wanted to know what happens when those best friends are not also friends with one another. So you're friend with Susie, you're friends with Jane, but Susie and Jane aren't friends with one another. If they're friends together, everything's great. If they're not friends, it increases the likelihood that you'll commit suicide. And the reason why is because you have to manage these relationships. If you know that the two of them aren't friends, then now you have to worry about what Susie will think when you do something with Jane or vice versa. And so there are lots of ways that the structure of the network has an impact on you directly, regardless of what flows across the ties. And so those two things, those two rules really apply to the shape of networks. The other three rules are about what flows across networks. The third rule is something that we've known for a long time. Our friends and family members affect us. Other people that we're connected to that directly have an impact on us. And there are some social scientists that are so committed to this radical individualism that I think they're even skeptical about this point, that you could be influenced by somebody else. But I think that there's been a lot of good work done in the last a few decades or so that really show that there is a direct effect. That just for example, when we randomly assign a depressed roommate to live with you, then you're more likely to become depressed yourself. And so we have these direct connections that we're all already very aware of because we can observe them in our own life. But the fourth rule is that our friends' affect us, right? And so the intuition here is that if I influence my friend, and if my friend influences their friend, whom I don't know, then I can indirectly influence my friend's friend, through a series of interactions, like dominoes falling one by one. And I think that's what's really captured the imagination of people who have been reading the research that we've been producing, is that for the first time we have this fantastic data, this fantastic pictures of the whole network, where we're able to see how we're all connected, like other social species in the form of a human superorganism. We may influence people that we're directly connected to, that we can see within our social horizon, but we also influence people beyond our social horizon. And in fact, one of the central themes of the book is that a lot of evidence suggests that we influence people up to 3 degrees of separation, to your friend's friend's friend. And so I think everyone has heard of 6 degrees of separation. Stanley Milgram, he did the great experiment where he estimated that we're all connected by 6 handshakes, and then that was turned into the Kevin Bacon game, right, which everyone loves to play. But if you influence people at 3 degrees of separation, it's sort of like you're reaching halfway to the whole global network. And so this is what we explore. It's not just obesity. It's not just happiness. It's lots of different things. And we also talk about some great stuff that other researchers have done that's consistent with this idea that we affect people up to 3 degrees of separation. And then the last thing is that the whole is great. It's that this idea that these complex interactions end up creating emergent phenomena that you couldn't explain just by looking at the individual parts. And so this is very much in keeping with the move towards complexity studies that's happened in the last 10 or 20 years, where what we're really trying to understand is, how does each neuron firing become thought? How does each star, flying through the universe become a galaxy? And how does each human being interacting with other human beings in these beautiful social networks, how do we organize ourselves to achieve things that we couldn't possibly dream of on our own?
Well, that was a terrific rundown. Now, let me explore this the idea that there are sort of 3 degrees of influence a little bit, because I found that interesting. So the idea was, so I think everybody, other than some strange economists, think that accept that our family and our closest friends, people we have personal face-to-face interactions with, influence us. But you show that it ripples out further than that. But it dies at about the third remove. So I can affect my friend can affect their friend, and that friend can affect another friend, with something that originated in me. But then it stops there. Why does it stop there? Why doesn't it ripple out further? So halfway into the network, if we are really connected to everybody by 6 degrees, halfway through the population is a long way. Well, it's still not going to be halfway, but why does it stop at 3?
Right, so we have 3 different ideas for this. The first one is that there's this intrinsic decay. And so your influence is going to be reduced as it passes from person to person because of signal loss. And so if you think about the kids' game of telephone, for example, where you have the kids lined up and you whisper in one of their ear, and then that person whispers in the next kid's ear, and so on, trying to pass a message from person to person, the message at the other end of the line is hardly ever the same thing as what you whispered in the first person's ear. And so it might just degrade over time, this message. Just for example, you might really try to influence one of your friends to start exercising, right? And maybe you have a really effective way to do that, and when your friend tries to do the same thing with their friend, they kind of lose some of the main ideas whenever it's being passed from person to person to person. Another possible idea is that our friends and family members are changing all the time. Now, those direct connections don't change very often. So, for example, in the Framingham Heart Study, what we find is that people change best friends at a rate of about 1% per year. So over the course of the 32-year study, about 1/3 of the people change their friends. But what that means is that your friends of friends are changing at about double that rate, or it's actually even more than that. And your friends of friends of friends are changing even faster because any one of those ties can be cut. And so out at 4 degrees of separation, from year to year, this might be a completely different set of people because of all the instability that's going on in the network. Mm-hmm. But the thing that we look at the most in the book is this third idea, which is this idea that social networks are in our nature, and that we evolved over the last hundreds of thousands of years to live in these small human groups where we would not have been connected to anybody by more than 3 degrees of separation. And so we talk about work by Robin Dunbar, an anthropologist, where this anthropologist has made an effective case for this idea that the natural human group size is about 150 people. And if you look at the average number of close friends that people have, which is about 5 or 6, then what that means is that in any one of these groups of 150 people, you're going to have 5 times 5 times 5, about 125 friends of friends of friends. And so if we lived in these groups over time, and you had some kind of selection pressure, so that, for example, groups that were able to coordinate action were able to survive better than other groups, and individuals living in those groups were themselves better off, then you can imagine natural selection acting on us to give us bigger brains, which is consistent with what a lot of neuroscientists are arguing, the social intelligence hypothesis, in order to manage all these relationships. But you wouldn't have needed to manage out to that 4th degree of separation because we didn't tend to live in groups that were any larger than that.
Outstanding. You're a great explainer, James.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, it's amazing how much you cover. Well, let's. I would like to get back to some of the evolutionary stories in a little bit about why we would be adapted to act within networks in the way that we do. Your chapter 7 is kind of I think the juiciest chapter in your book. But let's talk a little bit more about some of these specific cases of contagion through networks. In particular, let's talk a little bit about happiness, since I've done a good deal of work on happiness research. In the book, you talk about a result that you found that happiness is kind of contagious. I think I saw this in the news. Happiness is contagious. So tell us a little bit about that study and what it shows us about the dynamics in networks.
Sure. So this, again, comes from the Framingham Heart Study that Nicholas Christakis and I were fortunate enough to stumble on this social network information that they had been keeping for years, not for the purpose of studying social networks, but just to keep people coming back, right? So maybe they lose contact with you and they need to find out where you are, and if they know who your friend is and your coworker is, they're going to be able to call one of those guys and figure out where you are and get you to come back in the study for the next round. And
so the network stuff was completely incidental?
It was completely incidental.
Fascinating.
This is one of my favorite stories. Is that when Nicholas and I first met, we knew that what we needed was a really good data source, and we thought we were going to have to create it from scratch. And we did some back-of-the-envelope calculations, and we figured out we needed $25 million. And so we went to the NIH and we said, "Can we have $25 million, please?" And when they stopped laughing, then they actually said, "Why don't you do a pilot study?" So we thought what we were going to have to do is go to the Framingham Heart Study and start asking them at the next exam, who are your friends, who are your family members. And then when we found out how successful they were at keeping people in the study, we said, how in the world do you do this? And they pulled out these administrative records they'd been keeping for 30 years. And our jaws dropped. It was like our Petri dish moment, the mold falling in the Petri dish. So in any event,
that's terrific.
That's where we got the information for the obesity study and the smoking study, and we also asked people questions about their moods in this study. And so they did this at 3 different exams. So we had overtime data over about 18 years. And what we were able to show is that just like obesity and smoking, that happiness spreads up to 3 degrees. So that if your friend becomes happy, you'll become happy, but it's also true if your friend's friend becomes happy, or if your friend's friend's friends become happy, then you're also more likely to be happy yourself. Now, one of the interesting results here is that we were able to actually differentiate between happiness and unhappiness and how likely they are to spread. And what we found was that these happiness waves actually spread more reliably than the unhappiness waves, which helped to explain another result, which is that what we found was that the people at the center of these networks were more likely to be happy than the people on the periphery. And so just like people at the center of a network might be more susceptible to, say, getting H1N1, right, because there's someone out there getting flu, and if you're closer to everybody else in the network, then you're going to get it sooner than other people. You're also more likely to catch these emotional waves that run through the network. And so if there are more happy waves than unhappy waves, then on average you're going to tend to be happier.
Let's talk a little bit about how this works, because I think this is something I have just some worries about. I'm sure some other people do, which is, first of all, in a lot of these things with whether it's happiness or obesity or smoking, I guess part of the question is what the mechanism is that is responsible for the transmission through the network, and the other question is really just these questions about the direction of causality. Do happy people just have happier friends? If I'm in a network with 5 people, there might be a common cause. Like if I've experienced a tragedy in my life, it's probably affected these people in my social network as well. So it's going to be the case that our moods are going to be correlated, but maybe their moods aren't really affecting my mood, and my mood's not really affecting their mood so much as we are sharing in something that affects everybody in our network. So how do you tease those things out?
Right. So this is a very large source of misunderstanding by certain members of the blogosphere who decided to discuss our work without reading the paper. We take these alternative explanations very seriously. If you find clustering in a network, if you find 2 people who are happy who are connected to each other, there are a few things that could be going on. One is it's just due to chance, right? So you flip 2 coins, they both come up heads, right? And so you want to make sure that you have some method that's going to avoid that, keep that from happening. The way we deal with that problem is that what we do is we compare what we observe to a random network where we just arbitrarily assign people to be happy or not at the same rate. And we count up all the clusters there and compare them to what we observe. And when we do that, we're able to tell you that this clustering is off the charts, not possible due to random chance. So that's the first thing that's possible. The second thing that's possible is that maybe happy friends choose other people who are happy to be friends with.
Yeah.
This is what sociologists call homophily, which is a word that literally means love of like. And birds of a feather flock together is, I think, the way that people more commonly think of this characteristic. And so the way we deal with that is that whenever we're doing our modeling, what we do is we control for the state of the person that you became friends with at the time you became friends with them. And so what we're doing is we're partialing out this tendency for you to be happy or unhappy at the moment whenever you're becoming friends with other people. And in fact, we've done some nice statistical work on this. They're called Monte Carlo simulations. I don't want to freak out the audience here, but this is a fancy way.
You won't freak them out.
Okay. This is a fancy way of just saying that we make up our own data. right? So we know exactly what's driving that data, and then we apply these methods to that made-up data. And when we do that, what we're able to show is that this friends of a feather, birds of a feather flock together effect can't be driving the result. So that's the second thing. The third thing that's possible is that there's what we call a contextual effect. Right, and so maybe the circus comes to town, and you and I are friends, but we haven't talked about the circus. We both just get happier because we independently find out that it's come.
I got happier when you said circus.
Dancing bears, trapeze artists.
Bears on balls. They balance on the... Just they're wearing a little top hat.
That's right.
Makes you happy, yeah.
And so this is actually the most difficult problem to deal with because there are lots of different things that we don't observe that could be causing your happiness and my happiness to be going up and down together at the same time. But one thing that we do is we take advantage of the fact that in these network studies, sometimes one person will name another person as a friend, and that person doesn't name the first person back.
Snap.
And yeah, exactly. So the researchers are happy, the people are kind of sad, right? So
yeah.
But the reason why this is important is because if I name you as a friend and you don't name me back, what that means is that on average we can expect that I probably pay more attention to you. I think about you more often. I esteem you. And so as a consequence, what we expect is that you would have a stronger influence on me than I would on you. Because if you haven't named me as a friend, you may not even know who I am. Maybe I'm just making this up. Like, I would love for you to be my friend, but you don't even really know who I am. And so if it's the case that the circus comes to town and our moods go up and down together, then what that means is that when we look at these directions, this directionality in the network, that what our method ought to show is that you have just as much of an effect on me as I have on you. But that's not what it shows. What it shows is that you actually have more of an impact on me if I name you as a friend than you have on me if you don't name me back. Moreover, if you and I name each other as friends and demonstrate a stronger social relationship, then the effect size dramatically increases. And so if there's just one way friendship in the obesity study, we show that your chances of becoming obese if your friend is obese goes up by about 67%. And if you name each other as a friend, it almost triples your risk of obesity if your friend becomes obese. And again, this is not something that you could explain as a consequence of the circus coming to town. And so we take all these things very seriously. The methods that we use are actually a first cut. I'm sure that in the next 5 to 10 years there's going to be a gold rush to figure out ways to get these estimates to be even more precise. But I feel very confident that what we've found here is something beyond these other effects that people often come up with, and we really think it's influence.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the difference between cases like contagious happiness versus contagious obesity, because a lot of these different effects that these different factors that run through networks seem to work in different ways. So like emotional contagion is really plausible to me. Like somebody, your mom or your dad or your partner comes home and they're cranky. That makes you cranky. You might go into another room. Somebody else is there. You make them cranky. That just seems to be right. Or I had a friend once who we both liked to dance at parties, and we thought maybe we could be party motivators professionally because we can go and you just start dancing on the dance floor, and a few excited people dancing gets other people dancing, right? It clearly seems to just be the case that mood and emotion is infectious in that sort of way.
These are like the whirling dervishes.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. But it's harder to see how my being a little bit overweight affects somebody else's being overweight, right? It doesn't have the immediacy that that emotional contagion does. And you also, in the book, you give a nice account of why emotions aren't purely just internal, why they're broadcast to other people. But obesity doesn't get that same kind of explanation. So you could tell us how these different kinds of things work.
Right. So with obesity or with any of these health behaviors, it's important to realize that the kind of contagion we're looking at, it's like what we're observing is not, whether or not you have a virus and you spread the virus to another person. It's whether or not you have a cough and the other person starts coughing.
Yeah.
And so what's really important here is that this is just the first step. Like, we want to be able to drill down and figure out what is the mechanism where it appears that whatever's underlying a person's health behavior is spreading from one person to another. But what I should highlight is that one of the really fascinating results from our studies on obesity, on smoking, and also on drinking is that your friends who live hundreds of miles away appear to have just as strong an influence on you as your friends who live next door. And so people hear the results of the obesity story, and I think they often think, well, I guess it makes sense that I'm going to be like my friend because we go out to eat together, or we go down to the bar together, or we go jogging together. But in the people that we studied, some of them lived thousands of miles apart. They were friends that had moved away, and they'd continued being friends. And so what we think is going on is that this is about the spread of ideas. Right, so when you see your friend once a year, if they tell you, I just started jogging and I feel great, it might increase the chance that you think that that's appropriate behavior, that's something that you want to do to make your own life better. Or if you notice that they've put on a few pounds, it might make you a little more accepting of a body type that's larger than the body type that you have now. And even more interestingly, that change in ideas means that you can skip over a person in the network. And so, just for example, your friend might gain 15 pounds, and then you decide, well, that actually looks okay. He looks kind of healthy at that new weight. And then when you deal with your other friend, you stop bugging them about their weight. You start bugging them stop bugging them to exercise, and then that in turn has an effect where their health behavior changes as well, even if you didn't actually do anything yourself to change your own behavior. But these are all just conjectures, right? What we're hoping is that lots of researchers start to take seriously these social networks and help us to figure out what underlies these things that are spreading. So just for example, one of the things that we're going to be looking at next is the kinds of food people eat. We have these food frequency questionnaires in the Framingham Heart Study, and as a joke, we created the network of banana eaters to make the point that you could look to see, does banana eating spread in networks? And of course, that's not going to underlie the obesity epidemic. But you might find that people who, for example, eat more fast food or eat more foods with high fructose corn syrup, that kind of eating behavior spreads, and that helps to explain why we're seeing this spread in obesity from person to person to person.
So again, I think maybe some of the language of contagion or spreading gets on my nerves, and I think probably gets on other people's nerves as well, because you do. I mean, the paradigm case of contagion is something like a cold, or something that actually one person passes to another person through a handshake or by touching a doorknob that the other person later touches, and that there's some real medium of transmission that seems literal. Like when you talk about the influence that my friends' eating habits have on mine. What it sounds like, and what I think you are talking about, is that being social animals, being cultural, we imitate each other, we take our cues from other people, and we're more likely to take cues from people around us than people not around us. And so how is this different from just the fact that people pick up norms and habits from their sort of immediate social milieu? Is that the same thing as like catching it something, or I don't know. I don't think I have any big objection to it, but there's just like a worry, I think, about that language. It makes it sound like if my friend's friend was, secretly, dressed up in women's underwear, that could have an effect on my dressing up in women's underwear. But obviously, it's not that kind of thing is not transmissible through the social network. They have to be public behaviors. They have to be observed in a certain kind of way. So why isn't this just a story about people adopting norms? And I take the point, and I think this goes back to the discussion we were having about this change that we're trying to get people to see in the sciences, right? So what we are able to do for the first time
is to see what's happening in the whole network. Right, and so it sounds like you don't have a hard time understanding how your friends would be directly influential, right? So the question is, why would it stop at the end of your social horizon? Why wouldn't it keep going? When your friend is with other people, your friend is also influential to them, right? And so we have these streaks running through the network, these paths where everything that we do, everything that we say, that we think, that we feel, that we love, is going to have an impact on the people that we're directly connected to. And if it has an impact, then their behavior also changes, and that changed behavior is also going to have an impact on other people in the network. Right, so I think that in the past, when we've talked about norms, when we talked about these ideas of appropriate behavior, people would sort of say, "Oh, you get them from the group." Mm-hmm. Right. So if you're African American, for example, some people mistakenly think that you're going to do what African Americans do, or if you're poor, people think you're going to do what poor people do. And what we want to do is we want to turn this inside out and say, those might be proxies for the boundaries of these groups. But if you really want to know who is in which group, you need to look at the specific connections. Because there are plenty of poor people that hang out with rich people, and there are plenty of rich people that hang out with poor people. There's going to be these specific connections and these boundaries around those connections that are actually going to be relevant for explaining why some groups do things differently than other groups. In other words, I really think that what network science ultimately is going to help us to do is to help us to think scientifically about the evolution of culture.
Mm-hmm. So that's great. That's part of what I'm looking for. I think because just saying that people tend to download norms from the sort of ambient culture really does leave it very vague what the where they're getting their norms from, or where they're getting their ideas about what's acceptable. And so I like the idea that the network gives you something more specific to look at and helps you distinguish between different why do some groups of poor people, why do some networks of poor people have maybe the whole network helps each other rise out of poverty, and other networks of poor people help reinforce whatever behaviors partly explain their being in poverty. And I think that's an important insight. But another thing that I'm thinking of and wondering about is, do you have an idea about what kinds of things are likely to be communicated through the network? So, for instance, if I become friends with smokers, you're predicting that I become more likely to smoke.
Let me just sort of distinguish something. When your friend starts smoking, mm-hmm. and that's different from becoming friends with a smoker. Remember, because we're concerned about separating out the effect of people choosing friends because they have mm-hmm. a certain characteristic, we can't say anything about that. What happens at the moment when you become friends with somebody. What we're saying is that when your friend undergoes a change, your friend that you already made undergoes a mm-hmm. change, then it's likely to create a change in you.
Right. So I can't just become thinner by choosing thinner friends.
We have no evidence for that. And in fact, we have some contrary evidence on the other side. In the Premium Heart study, we looked at all the people who had a friend who became obese. We had almost 1,000 cases of this happening because, obesity mm-hmm. was running wild during this period. And we compared the outcomes of the people who dumped their fat friends to the people who remained loyal and kept those friendships. And guess which one of those groups was more likely to become obese?
The disloyal ones?
That's exactly right. And so the idea here is that, yes, if your friend is doing something that's not good for them, then there's a chance that they're going to change your ideas about your own appropriate behavior. But mm-hmm. we know from just hundreds of studies that every friend makes you healthier. Every friend makes you happier. And on balance, if you have to choose, what to do in the situation when your friend is doing something that you don't want to rub off on you, the best answer is not to get rid of that friend. Is to actually try to help that friend to achieve, a better lifestyle, to exercise, to eat less, to seek out help whenever they're feeling sad. Anything that they can do to make their lives better. And this is not rocket science, right? This is maybe a case, where some people think, why are we spending millions of dollars to justify, common sense? But I just want to make it perfectly clear, because I think some people came away from the obesity study thinking that the implication was that you needed to select friends based on whether or not they were obese, and actually the opposite is true.
Yeah. So yeah. Other things equal, it's better to have more friends. In general, you're healthier, you're happier, so forth. But suppose, and I'm just wondering, is there evidence about other kinds of cases? So, for instance, my fiance and I, we moved to Iowa a little over a year ago because she's in grad school here. Now, when we made the move, we weren't moving to change social networks, but we have acquired a new social network by being here. And we've acquired a new set of friends. So, is the work that you've done? Does it make any predictions about what happens when people acquire new friends? Not on the basis of we didn't pick them based on any attributes that they had exactly. They were just people who are in the same program here. So there's going to be some degree of homophily in self-selection. But suppose that our choice to move has nothing to do with any thoughts about health, but our friends here have different eating habits from our friends in Washington, D.C. Is there a prediction that our eating habits will change in virtue of acquiring new friends, or is it all just in the direction of if I already have friends and they have and there's a change in their behavior, then that affects me?
So I have to tell you that we don't know scientifically, because it's just so hard to sort out homophily from influence at the point of making friends, right? So, but I do have this intuition that because friends are so powerful, that if you do change one set of friends for another in this kind of circumstance, but you keep the overall health of your social network the same. So, say you feel just as close to the 5 people that you tend to hang out with in Iowa as you felt to the 5 people that you're most likely to see where you moved from. If those things remain equal, then if there's a difference in the habits between those two sets of people, then I think that you'll tend to move in the direction of the habits that the new set of people have.
Great. So I think that's important to get clear then that you're absolutely not giving people advice about which friends to have.
Right.
that it's not making predictions about that. Let's talk about a couple other kinds of cases that are very interesting and I think will interest our viewers. The effect that an individual's voting behavior has on other people's voting behavior. I found that fascinating. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, sure. So this comes from the very first work that I did on social networks, and like all good scientific ideas, it started with a commercial from the 1970s. So I'm not sure if everybody remembers this. We can actually post a link to this commercial, but it's of a woman who becomes so enthralled with her shampoo that she tells 2 friends, and the screen splits into 2, and then they tell 2 friends, and the screen splits into 2, and then so on and so on and so on. And pretty soon, lots of beautiful women are using this shampoo. And I was drifting to sleep one night, sort of thinking about all this work that had been done on the question of why we vote, and if you apply rationality to voting, it's very hard to explain it. And it occurred to me that this literature didn't take into account the fact that a decision like this is not made independently. We often even use the language of setting an example, of doing your duty. But these ideas that we have whenever we're explaining why we've engaged in this action are really evoking is this fact that we feel that our actions are influential with other people. So what I was able to do is I was able to take some great data from Bob Huckfelt and John Sprague, where they had done these snowball surveys where they went out and they talked to people about their political behavior, found out whether or not they voted, asked them to name some friends, and then they went and surveyed the friends as well. And then I was able to simulate from that data what happens when one person votes. And what we saw was that it actually creates these cascades where when one person votes, it can cause literally dozens of other people to vote as a consequence of these very small percentage chances of imitation. Because even though you might only have, say, a 1% chance of influencing one of your friends to do something different, each of them is also going to have an impact on their friends, and so on and so on and so on. And it's this exponential power of social networks that means that these friends of friends and these friends of friends of friends, there's so many of them that you have a small probability, but the expected number of those people that's going to change their behavior becomes rather large. Yeah. And now the great thing about that study was that it was then followed up by an experiment by David Nickerson at Notre Dame. This is my favorite paper in political science. We should post a link to this paper too, if we can.
Sure.
What he did is he went out and did one of these GOTV studies, get out the vote studies, where he knocked on people's doors to encourage them to vote in an election in a couple of cities. I forget, they're in the Midwest, this is not rocket science again. Lots of people have done these get out the vote studies, but what he did was really interesting. He had a treatment where he had people ask the person who answered the door to vote, and a control where he told them to recycle. He asked them to recycle. And so he did this in 2-person households. And every time he knocked on the door, he made a note of who answered the door so that then he could go check voting records later on. And what he found was, like normal, you got a small bump in the number of people who were willing to vote if you knocked on the door. It was I think it was about a 10% increase in the chance of voting by the person who answered the door. But the person who didn't answer the door also had a significantly higher chance of voting. And in fact, 60% of the effect of the one person knocking on the door, talking to this random stranger for just a few moments, was passed on through the network to the second person in the household. And so this is the first experimental evidence we have of a person-to-person-to-person effect of political behavior flowing through networks.
So the idea is that I come knock on your door, you open the door, and I say, have you thought about voting? And you're like, oh, I've thought about it. And then I leave, and you turn to your spouse, and you say, and she's like, who was at the door? Some guy asked me if I was thinking about voting. Is it that's the idea? That's how it works.
That's exactly right. There's not really any other way to explain why the second person would have gone to vote, because it's an experimental treatment, right? So this person wasn't contacted at all by the researcher, and the researcher, David Nickerson, he was actually very careful to make sure that he wasn't just comparing, knocking on the door to not knocking on the door, because there's lots of things that can get in the way there in doing that comparison, because it might be different kinds of people, right? So he knocked on the door and just gave them two slightly different messages and measured the impact of that, not just on the person who was directly treated, but on that person's co-resident.
So I mean, that seems so strong that it to me that almost seems like it has to be wrong because the effect is so strong. Because in some sense that would imply that there are $100 bills laying all over the sidewalk and nobody's picking them up. So why can't the Mars Corporation or whatever send a guy out to just knock on doors? Have you considered having a Snickers? And he just tries to knock on as many doors as possible, and sales of Snickers go through the roof. Why doesn't so I guess, and this goes back to something I was asking a little bit earlier. Is there in this sort of set of theories about networks ideas of the kinds of things that are and aren't likely to be transmissible? So the fact that I privately dress up in ladies' underwear isn't going to do anything. But like the fact that I eat a Snickers bar might, because you've mentioned dietary habits. Suppose I'm interested in spreading my religion, and so there is some of this. The Mormons come around, the Jehovah's Witnesses come around. How effective is that in transmitting these ideas? And so I'm just kind of interested in whether there is a theory that generates predictions about things that won't be affected by that won't be transmitted through networks.
Right. So I'm now feeling a little hungry thanks to you, and I'm hoping very much that Snickers do spread in networks. So there's a lot of stuff there. Okay. First of all, we do find that things spread differently in networks. So just for example, when we look at health behaviors, we get this interesting result that I talked about earlier, that your friend who lives hundreds of miles away has just as much of an impact on you as your friend who lives next door. But when we look at emotions, we actually find that that's not true. That's only your close social contacts who live nearby, your nearby sibling, your nearby friend, that have an influence on you. And so what that suggests is that emotions are being transmitted via a different mechanism. And we theorize that what's going on there is that in order to catch someone's emotional state, you actually have to have lots of interactions. Now, one interesting thing is that our data ends in 2003. They're just now doing processing the wave that came after that, and that not coincidentally, that's the year that Facebook came online. And so I'm very interested to know if some of these effects of emotional transmission are actually going to be extended now because we have more interactions online, and I think people are actually coming to have more of a life online, so that they might actually be more affected across larger distances by these changes in moods.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, earlier this year when the Iowa Hawkeyes beat the Penn State Nittany Lions, big upset, I got right on Twitter to watch the Penn State people complain about it. And then I could send Twitters because there's a little tag that for the game, and I could rub it in a little bit, and that was making me happier. So yeah, it seems like there's people. Definitely, so I was home alone, right? I didn't have anybody to, whoop and holler about the game with, but I was able to go right to the computer and see, and get the satisfaction of weeping Penn State fans and cheering Hawkeyes fans. So I think there's probably something there, yeah?
Yeah, no, I'm expecting, and there's this great research that's happening now where they're starting to automatically classify status updates according to their emotional content. And so this work that's been done by these guys at Facebook, for example, where they're able to show that you get more happy messages around the holidays and you get a lot more sad messages around unexpected deaths. So when Michael Jackson died, there were a lot of very sad people on Twitter and on Facebook. But I want to go back to something you just talked about earlier as well, which was you find this effect impossibly strong. That 60% of the effect was passed from the first person to the second person. These were two-person households in the Midwest. And so what's the most likely composition of that household?
Of a two-person household?
In the Midwest.
Just a married couple or cohabitors.
That's exactly right. And so these are the people that you would most expect to affect one another. And so this brings up another really important point, which is what we find over and over again is that whenever we look to see if things spread between people who know each other only a little bit, between acquaintances, or even between neighbors, people who live in the same block, we consistently find that it doesn't. That things spread through these deep, close, real-world social contacts. And so that has implications, actually, for our life online. You are not going to be influenced by every single one of the hundreds of Facebook friends that you have. You're still only going to be influenced by the people that you interact with the most. So when we have looked at, for example, the spread of music tastes or the spread of books that people post online or the spread of the movies that they post to their Facebook profiles, we do find that some of those are contagious, but not between all those hundreds of Facebook friends. They're contagious between picture friends. And by picture friend, what I mean is that we isolate just those people who have uploaded a picture of another person and tagged that person. And so there you get back down to this manageable number of people that you probably have a real-world close social relationship, much more so than the set of Facebook friends. And that's the conduit through which these influences and these emotions flow.
Excellent. Well, we're coming toward the end of our time. What sort of implications of this research that we haven't talked about would you like to chat about for a few minutes before we end?
Well, I know. So you've actually written on free will before, right?
Mm-hmm. Sure.
Yeah. So I think that there's a big implication here that people, when they hear that their friend's friend's friend has an influence on them, they think, oh my God, there are hundreds of people out there that are doing things that are affecting me. I must not have any control over my life. And so some people have taken this research to mean that this is the end of free will. And we actually, in the book, we turn this completely on its head. Because while your friends' friends' friends influence you, and there are thousands of them, you also influence them. And for me, the way this has affected my own life is it's caused me to make these beneficial changes. I lost about 5 pounds after the obesity study, and I've kept it off because I realize now that if I live healthier, it's going to influence my family to live healthier and their friends to live healthier and even their friends to live healthier. If you tell someone that they can influence 1,000 people, I think that the average person reacts to that by taking greater responsibility over their own life.
Well, I think that's fascinating. Yeah, I mean, it's one of those about the sort of the question of agency. Yeah, I mean, these findings don't do much to change my view, which is that lots of things have an influence on your behavior. Like what you ate for lunch. Might make your stomach a little queasy, and if your stomach is a little queasy, it might change your mood, and your mood might change what you say to someone. But you don't say that like bad tuna fish is responsible for the fact that you snapped at your girlfriend.
And you certainly don't want to tell her that.
That's right.
It was the tuna fish. I promise.
I didn't do it. Yeah. So I mean, and I think the conventional or the most widespread view among philosophers is this kind of compatibilist view that there's nothing, there's no incompatibility between actions being determined by various external forces, as long as certain other conditions for internal agency are met. Whether I had the opportunity to deliberate and choose in the right sort of way. So I agree with you. I don't think it in fact threatens free will. I'm fascinated by this idea that if you have a stronger sense of the potential impact that you have on other people, then you'll feel some kind of obligation to act more responsibly, and in some ways, that actually, brings to mind, one of the things that I like to think about, which is kind of the inevitability of culture war. Not everybody's going to agree on what kinds of norms they would like other people to adopt, and so, I'm going to be acting one way to try to influence people in one direction. Somebody else is going to be acting another way. And, people who are equidistant between the two of us in a network are going to be getting these opposing influences. And it's not clear to me, like, who wins. I guess who wins is whoever is, which trend tends to dominate more in a particular network. And if somebody's on the margin or on the fence about a particular issue, they could definitely be tilted, by all of their friends and friends having a certain view. In just the same way that somebody who's on the fence about voting might be tipped into doing it by, just talking about it with somebody else.
So at the end of the day, maybe we're all like Olympia Snow. With these huge forces battling it out, and she's got to make a decision. And ultimately, at the end of the day, because those forces balance each other, it's still really up to her. Free will still exists.
Yeah. Nobody made Olympia Snow do anything. That's really well. Before we finish up. One thing that you talk about a fair bit is the nature of cooperation. So it's this ongoing. To me, it is the subject of social science in some sense. How it is that people manage to solve certain kinds of collective action problems. How individual sense of their own interest gets aligned with the public good. And you think that networks. Thinking about how networks works, sheds some light in how we're in fact able to solve some of these problems. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So cooperation is obviously very important. It's something that human beings do that's very different from other species. Other species cooperate, but they tend to do it with kin, and they also don't do it very often. We do it all the time with strangers in very, very large groups. And so, in essence, I think there's a wide range of scholars in different fields who think that cooperation really is fundamentally what makes us human. But cooperation requires connection. And one interesting thing that's happened in the study of cooperation in the last few years is that we've realized that what's really important is this capacity for you to drop out of the game. Because if we just think that you're forced to interact with another person who can take advantage of you, then what that suggests is that cooperation will never happen, because the people the free riders, the people who take advantage of your good nature are always going to win. But if you have people who can disconnect, they're called loners actually in these models, then they can actually do better than the people who are trying to free ride on the cooperators, because once the cooperators are all gone, then there's no more goodies for the free riders to live off of.
Right.
And so what ends up happening is you get these cycles in populations where you have these first of all these people who are not connected, and then they learn to connect and cooperate with each other, and then you have the rise of these free riders who prey on cooperators, and you get enough of them around, and you get some people who say forget it, and they go off and do their own thing, and you get these beautiful heteroclinic cycles. I love that word, heteroclinic. Let me say it again, heteroclinic. But you get these beautiful cycles that can really help to explain not just why we cooperate more than other species, but why we have variation. And some of our work actually has started to explore the genetic basis of both cooperation and connection, and we're finding that genes actually play a very strong role in these different kinds of behaviors.
Terrific. One thing that it reminded me of, I was writing a little profile, big win for political scientists. Elinor Ostrom just won a Nobel Prize in economics, and in some of her work, she shows that in experimental settings, when people playing these kind of experimental public goods games, that simply allowing people to talk to one another face to face and come to a consensus on a rule that everybody's going to follow and on a set of sanctions enables them to actually cooperate in a way that they otherwise couldn't if they couldn't communicate in that kind of way. And in relation to your book, that was making me think, well, who you're going to talk to, is a function of what network you're in, and whether or not a set of norms that enable cooperation is going to spread or not might have something to do with how the network in a particular group is structured.
Right, and so you think about these interactions you have with people. If someone cheats you, you stop interacting with them. And so this is one thing that some scholars have just started to think about, this coevolution of these networks, of these friendships or these interactions we have with people, with your past interactions with them, their past behavior. So if they're good to you, then you play with them again. If they're bad to you, you seek another partner. And that's, I think, just now starting to help us understand the structure of some of these networks. And it's really interesting, because the fact that these connections exist means that we must have adapted in some way for them to be good on balance. Because if they weren't good on balance, then over the last hundreds of thousands of years when we've been living in these social networks, we probably would no longer have them. Evolution would have, made these people who said, forget you, these loners, they would have made them actually do better than the people who tried to live in groups. And so the fact that social networks exist is itself evidence that social networks are inherently good.
All right. Well, that's a provocative claim, but I'll leave it there. Thanks so much, James, for coming on. Your book with Nicholas Christakis is Connected.
The Surprising Power. Yeah, go ahead.
You say it.
Connected. The surprising power of our social networks and how they shape our lives. And we have a website at connectedthebook.com.
All right. Well, thanks, James. It was fun.
Thank you.